use about 2 minutes to introduce him and give you a very brief introduction. He has been a great achiever, but small highlights I will give now. Dr. Krishnakumar is the Managing Director of Giract, which is a food business research and consultancy. He is basically a chemical engineer and then did his computer science and then management science for his doctorate. He has a long management experience, and you will see that once he starts speaking, both in India and abroad. And before he started out as a food industry consultant with more than about 40 years ago, and in Geneva. His expertise and experience is in consumer marketing, which he had when he was with GlaxoSmithKline in Delhi. He's published many articles on food ingredients, which is his specialty. He does both research and consultancy in that area. And of course, he has presented papers and published in this area for a long time. With his vast experience in international food and food ingredient markets, their trends and opportunities, he has had numerous opportunities to manage strategic as well as operational projects in the ingredient sector across the world. And he has initiated landmark studies on starches, polyols, wheat gluten, hydrocolloids, savory flavors, mineral supplements, antioxidants and emulsifiers. This is just a small list. I'm sure when you listen to him, you will understand his breadth of experience and the depth of his commitment, which is what I have observed. So over to Dr. Krishnakumar. We will listen to him. I request all of you to please put your phones on silent mode or switch them off. And after the end of this, at the end of the session, you may please ask questions. Thank you very much.
Dominating this field, it's good for food science. Basically, what we're going to do today is I'm going to share with you what I see as food, and you'll see as I go along that there are many facets to food, and that's what is possibly the most interesting thing, because when we start to look at food, our own experience is first starts at home, then it goes on to the little restaurant that our parents take us to when we are children. We understand what those varieties are, and finally we actually go ourselves with our parents probably, and then later on by ourselves to a retail shop and buy some food. And this food is in different formats and different stages of completion. So you then get a feeling that a food is not just a fuel. A food is probably much more than what we understand what it is. So let's start this. I want to know from you people as to what you think is a food. How would you define a food? Anyone here? Please. I'm sure you know the answers. Much better than I do. Just say, what do you think a food is? How do you define a food? Supposing somebody from Mars comes to you, suddenly lands and says, how do you people live? Or whatever. And you say, we have food. And he says, what is food? Tell me. How would you describe that? Can somebody say something about it?
Fuel for the body.
Fuel for the body. There you are. That's already one. So you got the fuel part of it. It's very important. Is there anything else that you say as to what food is? Sorry? Nutritious substance. So already we now have a second facet of food. We've started with the fuel function. Now somebody else is saying, hey, there is also nutrition. Let's see if there is any other facet to food. Do you have anything else? Any other ideas about food?
It supports the physiological needs of the body.
It's supposed to?
Physiological needs of the body.
Physiological needs. Now, she's getting into the health aspects, and she says it also does something to the physiological needs. We'll look into them and see what they do. So, we started with fuel. which is very good. Then we went to nutrition, and now we are on to physiological. Already you see that there are at least 3 facets to food. Let's see more. I mean, there must be more, right? Because food is something that's everywhere. Food is what we really want to live for sometimes. Food is something that drives all of us. Food is something that everybody craves for. We know we can't live without food. So food is in the center of this world. So you can't just have 3 definitions. It has to be more. Food has always been there for millions of years. So what's so great about food? And I think you start by getting some kind of definitions of food, trying to understand the facets of food. That is what a food scientist should do first of all. Because normally, as food scientists, we look at the chemistry, we look at the technology, and we just put on blinkers, and we look at the fuel part, we look at the nutrition part, and we look at the physiological parts even. But can a food be more than that? As the Oxford Dictionary says, any nutritious substance that people or animals suddenly, they don't talk about cars, so the fuel doesn't work that well, but certainly it goes from human beings to animals, eat or drink, or then we come down to the plants, which absorb in order to maintain life and growth. So there are 2 key parameters here that you've already seen. One is to live, you need food, and then to grow, you need food. So at least these 2 parameters are important. And then we said, oh, but then it should also give us nutrition. But nutrition is within that growth. The physiological needs are within that growth. Is there anything else that can be interesting about food? Is it all about eating to live because you can't do otherwise? And then you want to grow. Does it stop there? No. Food is everywhere, and food is everything in our life. Take these other perspectives of food. Food is tradition. So you say, hey, I come from Chennai, and that place has got a tradition of food. That actually is a motivator for me because I associate myself with that place. And as a company selling food, I can then say, hey, I can use that tradition of this food, the facet of this food, to actually market my food better. Because this consumer does not just want to grow and live. No, this consumer also wants to live happily. And so some part of that happiness, this food can bring. And that is a tradition that food can bring. So already you have one indicator that it's not just the physiological, the fuel and the nutrition needs, which are of course very important, but there are other needs. Then what else are the other facets? You can go on and on and on. Culture. Food is part of the culture. Almost all cultures have their own foods. In India, you know that there is such a diverse culture, but then you ought to say diverse culture of food, basically. Because every culture is almost defined by its food habits first, the language they speak second. These 2 actually define a culture in most places. And so you see in a place like Europe, you have small countries, Belgium, Netherlands, even Luxembourg. They all have their own food cultures, even today, and they maintain it. So the food and the culture part go very strongly with each other. So once again, if you're a food scientist, you need to understand that hey, I need to understand that I'm actually not just catering to as a fuel or just to grow or just to live. No, it's a lot more than that. I'm catering to the tradition, I'm catering to the culture part. But the culture itself is a very widely used terminology, and you have it everywhere. So you take a country like the US. What is happening there? You see that the companies around, the food companies, they're actually trying to harmonize that culture. Why do you think an American going out wants to go to a McDonald's? Not because it's cheap, not because it's particularly tasty, it's because that's the culture he was brought up in. And he knows what he's going to get. So when he gets into a McDonald's outlet, he knows that the bun is going to taste like this, the burger is going to taste like this, the fries are going to taste, and they are uniform and they are the same. So what actually McDonald's has done, most importantly, is to ensure in the consumer's mind, in your mind, in my mind, that don't worry, whenever you step into a McDonald's, you will get the same burger. Now that is the culture that we are talking about. So human beings want to associate themselves with a culture, and this is a McDonald's culture that they've created. Just like when, I don't know how many of you are from the south of India. How many? Can you raise your hands? Wow, okay. And how many from the east of India? Nobody? Yes, there are. From the north, there are people here, and from the west, no one, okay. But as you know that each of these regions of India have their own cultures. And do you know one of the most important problems that people coming from one region to the other have today? It's about the food. It's about the food culture. So when I move from here, if I'm a Tamilian or I'm a South Indian, I move to Delhi, one of my first problems is to get used to that food. Now, if it is a fuel, if it's only for physiological needs and if it's only as a nutrition, I should do that. It's the same potato, same calories. But I don't. Why? Because that's not the culture I was brought up with. And so it's very important for, as a food scientist, to understand that. And many food scientists don't take this into account when they go for their first job. They go in and say, oh, I know all the technologies. I know fermentation, I know how to measure this bacteria, I know everything. And then the marketing guys come and say, no, you're not going to do any of those. This is a very soft processed product, so you don't process it at all. And so you don't understand why. But then that customer wants it only that way because his culture is different. So what you need to understand is not just the supply end of food, as I call it, which is its basic functions, but also its numerous facets. Now, food can also be a poison. That shocks you, right? There's a proverb in Tamil. I'm from Tamil Nadu. It says anything in excess can be a poison. And food actually has been proven almost to be a poison in the US. So if you take the US, what happened was till about the 2000s, the government actually promoted cheap food because they wanted people to get cheap food. It was almost called the economic legislation, by which the government told all the big companies, go ahead and make cheap food, we'll protect you, because the consumer has got to get cheap food. What happened? You know what happened. They all got obese in large numbers. The government's bills for medicine increased. They were in debt trouble. So come 2000, the government says, oops, I've made a mistake. I must change. And what do? I must have some kind of a social legislation by which I say, make sure that nutrition is an integral part of that. So even the US government has got it wrong when it started to look at its food policy. So you've got to be very careful when you define food and what its functions are. Now, having taken you through that little market for food, you know that food, you can get it, as I said, at home. You can cook it at home. Or you can go to the restaurant. Or you can go to the retail shop and buy food. And that food in the retail shop is made in a factory. So when you come to a factory, you find some food there being made. Let's take a soup. When the consumer actually consumes that soup, it's exactly like the soup that he or she prepares at home. But he doesn't even know that it may not be anything to do with the preparation that he has made in the kitchen. The two products are entirely different. They are almost like infant formula and mother's milk. So when you go to a factory and start to make food, often you should not really worry about how it's made at home, probably. What you should be bothered about is what kind of product is it? How do I deliver it? And hence, working backwards, how do I start producing it in the factory? This is a very, very different approach. Often you find for the same product that's cooked at home and at the factory, the raw materials may be different. Basic raw materials. The processing is completely different. The shelf life is different. Everything is different. So, you need to be aware that a processed food is a very different product from a food that's made at home. So, if you were to define what I call as processed food, the definition is that foods that have been treated or prepared by a special method, especially in order to preserve them. So one of the key aspects of a processed food in which most of you will be involved over a period of time is what is called a shelf life. Now, when you want to cook food at home, you can cook, but it doesn't keep for long. You know that. You can keep it for 1 day, 2 days in the refrigerator. After that, you can't keep it. Whereas a processed food in general is supposed to last that long. So you have many examples of processed foods versus homemade foods where that shelf life or the life of the product makes all the difference, right? So you have now the whole definition of foods versus processed foods. And what you will be focusing on in your lives is not more with processed foods, but all the time keeping the general foods at the back of your mind. That's what you will be working on. The model is your food, but what you will be making probably is a completely different product, which you will have to help the consumer understand and be honest about it and communicate all the benefits and the differences over regularly cooked food. And it's the biggest challenge that the industry faces today across the world, right? So, if you were to then go and look at foods in India generally, what we have tried to do here is classify food according to the time you eat that food. In general, you have a breakfast food that can consist of non-Indian foods, breakfast cereals, for example, bread, it can be various other products. On the other hand, it can also be local Indian foods. It can be an idli or whatever you take, parathas, whatever. Then you have a lunch or dinner, the two major meals. You have a separate section called snacks, which is an in-between meal. That is, it's between lunch and dinner or breakfast and lunch, invariably. You have desserts, which are sweets, and they normally tend to be classified in snacks in India, but abroad you tend to put them in a different category because invariably after dinner you eat a dessert. And finally, the beverages, which just go right through the day. So these are more or less the kind of foods that you consume, and this is going to be the case for all of you. You'll be working more or less on all these kinds of products. What is interesting is, when you look at foods in India, what you're saying is there are foods which are Indian and there are foods which are non-Indian. For example, an instant noodle is a non-Indian food, right? Whereas a paratha or a chapati is your Indian food. Now, when you take the plethora of Indian foods that are available across the country, you see that in every single culture, they cater to all these categories that we have here, right across all these categories. You can find products. You can find products for all these, except that you may not find the products in a retail shop yet, but you do find them in the kitchen And in almost all the cases, you find it in the food service, by which I mean the restaurants, for example. So what we're saying now is, as far as India is concerned, we have got a huge and very long history of food, which means at home we have a thorough knowledge of how to make foods, and that unfortunately is fading over a period of time, but we still have a huge amount of knowledge, which thanks to the software today, we are putting that into the internet, so you can actually access the recipe. So today, cooking at home, we're covering everything. The restaurants, they take care of everything that's difficult to cook at home. So today, between the two, you cover everything. So you ask the question, why processed food at all if these two are good enough? Well, you have two major reasons. One is the cost. You're going to see that over a period of time, processed foods will get the cost down enormously because of the quantities made, because of many, many reasons. So first reason is the cost. Home cooking is very expensive. Cooking and eating at the restaurant is also expensive. So you need a methodology of eating food which is cheap. Now that is only possible through the processed food industry. The second reason is the shelf life, which we said earlier. You want to keep food for 10 days, 15 days. It's not going to be possible either through your home cooking or through your restaurant cooking. You need the help of the food science based processed foods. So processed foods will play a dominating role in all countries over the future. It is already playing a huge role in the developed world. In China, if you go, processed food industry is enormous, it's taken over, and in India it's still small, but over a period of time it will be huge. And at that time, people like all of you will be required to help India reach that goal of producing good quality, nutritious, and at the same time inexpensive food to everybody. And that goal probably can only be met through food science. That goal cannot be met through the kitchen or through the restaurants. And this is a very important point that you need to hang on to. Because once again, I'm saying that if you need to supply relatively inexpensive, but at the same time good quality and long-lasting shelf-life foods to the people, neither the home kitchen nor the restaurants can help you with. But at the same time, as I told you very clearly, that processed food is not at all the same as the kitchen food. We said that. It's like infant formula and mother's milk, literally. So the processed food industry should be able to say to the consumer that, hey, if you want to cook food at home, please do that. That may be your best option. But if ever you're not able to do for some reason, be that for cost, lack of knowledge, time, it could be any reason, convenience, because you may want to go out at that time, or you may want to watch the television, you may want to spend the time with the kids rather than at the kitchen. So if all these reasons are there, then you have two choices. You can go to the restaurants, or you can come to us as processed food manufacturers. But the restaurants are going to be expensive for you. So if you want to do that on an ongoing basis, your only way out is to come to us. We will ensure that we give you products which are as nutritious as possible and as inexpensive as possible. This is going to be the future in almost all the countries in the world. This already happened in the West, and it's most likely to happen in India too. This would be the summary. But what I told you about the diversity of cuisines is very, very important. It's diverse across the world and diverse very much so in India, which means the onus is on you to understand that diversity. And that diversity, we remember, it's not just food science. It's linked to culture, tradition, a whole range of reasons. So it's up to you to understand and see how you can deliver that diversity through food science and processed food. So this is a mega challenge that is in front of you, all of you people. I'm sure you'll achieve it, but it's a very, very big challenge. Now, what you also need to understand is in what formats food is available. And this can be in raw material form. Flour, spice mixes. So when you go to a supermarket in India today, there are huge shelves of flour. There's a massive area where dal is sold, your lentils are sold. Rice bags, huge ones are sold. You come to the West, you will not find any of them. You do not find 5-liter oil cans. You don't find them. The oil cans are very, very small. Flour is sold in small bags in a small area of the supermarket. Rice, you will find 6, 7 little bags. You don't find lentils in more than about 3, 4 layers of the supermarket. So basically, the West, the whole thing has changed, which means the raw materials have given way to semi-finished to finished products. That's happened. Whereas in India, we still see a large section with raw materials, but that is going to change. And that's where you people are going to play a role as to how that raw material here is going to change over to that format, which is ready to cook or even ready to eat at a later stage. Now, as I told you, India is right now more or less here. This is where it is right now. It's mostly raw materials, very little fully processed food that you get, which really means what? You're paying a lot of money to eat that food. It's just, food is far too expensive to make. How much your wastage, the time that you spend, you could be doing so many other things. So in all those ways, it doesn't work. But emotionally, it's completely a different matter. The mother feels that she must give a very nutritious food to the child, so she puts into the lunch box parathas with ghee dripping and deep fried potatoes, and she says this is homemade food which is very healthy, and to me that looks exactly like a burger with french fries. It's the same with so much fat in it, but that is all about emotions. That's not going to go away soon, but over a period of time you will see the same mother trying to go from that to that, which is ready to cook. The ready to cook provides a lot of benefits. In what ways? The ready to cook, first of all, is cheaper than a ready to eat food. A ready to eat food today, if you go and buy these boxes of whatever, chana, masala, whatever, they cost about 100 rupees per pack. So for a family of 4, you probably need 2 packs a day, which means you're going to spend 200 rupees a day just for one side dish. And if you multiply that by 30, you're ending up with 60,000 rupees just for one side dish for the family. So that's never going to work. And unfortunately today what people don't understand is that those people who can actually afford that 60,000 already have a cook at home. So they don't want to buy this at all. So these products, if you notice, they've not grown at all. And you would have seen in the marketplace a lot of products which have come and gone. And they don't get attractive at all over a number of years. The reason is very simple. The target group is not there. But if you notice one single product, which is the dosa dough, you see that this product is only about 10 to 15 years old, and today almost all households in south of India, they use that product. It's an amazing invention. Now, this is really food science. This is exactly what you people should be doing in the future. Look at that product. Somebody thought about it and said, look, how do I make a dosa at home? And that's how you need to start. How do I make it? I have to first go through this heavy process of grinding all those products with these huge grinders. I then need to clean them up. That's going to be a big task. And then If my son comes and says, hey, can I have a dosa now? I said, no, tomorrow, not now. That makes no sense. When he wants to have a dosa now, I said, no, it's tomorrow. There's something called fermentation, and it's got to go through that process. So I can explain that to you, how the bug comes and eats the sugar and goes it. Come on, you got to get the dosa, you can't. So what has happened is, somebody found out what is the most difficult part of that process that housewife or house husband goes through while making a dosa. And that is that preparation of the dough. And somebody put that on the shelf and it takes off. But it still needed other inputs such as the chilled shelf in the supermarket, the refrigerator at home. So once you add all these inputs, the dosa dough becomes a reality. Plus, the dosa dough is much cheaper to buy than the dosa at the restaurant. So it is still very, very cost effective. So it gives you the best of both worlds. On one hand, it lessens all the hassles that you have to make a dosa, but at the same time, it provides you with that benefit of cost. And this will be the biggest challenge for food scientists for every single product. Dosa dough is just one, but there are 1 million solutions waiting to happen, and you can all make it happen. And this is how you need to think about food. When you see food the next time, any food, and you say, how is it made? Can I make any difference in this? And what is that difference? Will that difference be significant enough for the consumer? If it is not, he or she is not going to bother. You say, I'm going to change the color from red to yellow. They say, no, that's not important. It's not interesting either. But if you want to make it much more attractive, yes, it makes it interesting. I'm going to reduce the number of ingredients that they use because they're so difficult to find in the market. I'm going to do that. And I'm going to replace them with some kind of a mix that they can add instead of going around to all the shops looking for those fancy ingredients. That makes a lot of sense. I'm going to introduce a soft technology that will make it exactly like the home cooked product. That makes it interesting. So the challenge for you when you look at a food the next time is, how is it made? Rather than saying how good it is, of course it's always there, but you should seriously look at the food and every single food that you see, how is it made? Can I make a difference? And that's what a food scientist needs to do. Do you get that point? I mean, do you have any questions or any opinions on that? Please stop me while I'm speaking. If you then see, please, yeah.
How safe are processed foods?
Please.
How safe are processed foods?
Good question. How safe do you think they are? And what exactly do you mean by safety? Let me ask you two questions. What according to you is a safe food? In what way you think a food will be safe that you make at home? Do you think the food that you make at home is safe? It is? Yes? What makes it safe, do you think?
Hygienic conditions, preparation.
Okay. Right, one. What else can be safety?
And we do not add any preservatives which processed foods contain.
Right. So that brings up a very important point, because you think adding a preservative actually makes it unsafe. Right. Now this is exactly what's happening in Europe. That's the backlash that we have right now in the food industry. The first one may be or may not be true. I can assure you that most of the certified companies that make food are very specific about hygiene. And I can assure you they are much more hygienic in most of the houses that I've seen in India. So to me, I'm not saying yours or hers or whatever, but hygiene per se, I think in a processed food, you get a much better hygiene. How many people have you heard who've died eating some Nestle food or whatever in India? If it were the case, it would have come up immediately. You don't. I'm not saying they don't die at all, but the numbers or the percentage of such happenings are very, very rare. And that's also true internationally. It does happen because there is no zero risk, but the risk is certainly lower. For example, a lot of people don't understand that flying in planes is about the safest way. Statistically, it has been shown that the number of people who have died from plane crashes is the least as compared to a car or a train or a bus or whatever. So this is a feeling that people have, which a food scientist has to face and ask the question, exactly what are those elements that may make a food unsafe and how can I overcome those? You pointed out two important things, but there are other bits. But certainly, if it is unhygienic and what you really mean is bacteria presence, etc., which will make a food unsafe. But a food can also be unsafe due to packaging, poor packaging. A food can be unsafe due to, as scientists, water left behind when you're not supposed to. Through oxygen, it can come and damage a food. You know about antioxidants. Exactly the same way, the preservative has been there to exactly expand the shelf life of a product. Now, these preservatives have all been tested over a period of time, 50, 100 years. In labs first, and they were given what is called an E number. I don't know how much you know about all those, but they were certified by authority, scientists like you, and then they've been used over the last about 50, 100 years. There has been no conclusive proof that they are unsafe, so nobody is able to say anything against it. But there is a feeling that, look, when my grandmother made this particular food, she never used preservatives. That is the problem. But why is this guy, when he's using it, why is he using it? So you get a feeling that it's unsafe because it is not familiar to you. And that is, we come back to square one and say, these two are different products. So when you think of a processed food as real food that you make in the kitchen, you get into a problem. So you need to differentiate the two and say, this is a completely different product. It may have a preservative, it may have an emulsifier because it's got to mix the water and the oil, it may have other needs, but it's a different product. And from there on, if you look at it from that point of view, as a food scientist, I would say, processed food is as safe as you want it to be. So it's really up to the company that makes the product which can make it safe. You talk of lead levels, for example, in some noodles. I don't want to name any brand, but you certainly are all aware. But when you see the overall lead levels in food in India, I'm astonished, I'm shocked. It's nothing as compared to what they found in that particular noodle, if at all. So all I'm saying is, one is perception, one is reality. We have to live with the perception of the consumer, exactly like you. But as a food scientist, you need to wear two hats. One is as a consumer, what does he or she think? But one is science, because there is science and there is fact. We all believe in science, we're all scientists. So you can't run away from science. There is science and there is perception. You'll have to marry the two carefully and explain to the consumer over a period of time, and which we're not doing very well, but not only here, all over the world. But over a period of time, you'll have to speak to that consumer and explain about this particular aspect, and hopefully they'll understand. Is that okay?
Thank you.
Right. This is how you can say more or less foods have evolved over time. First, it was completely at home. There were no restaurants. Then came the restaurants. So you had to go to the restaurant, eat there, come home. But then somebody told you, no, we'll also pack it for you and you can take it home and eat. So that became the next trend. And then we saw all these masalas and everything else slowly coming up. When they said, look, you got 5 different spices which you got to use, you got to buy them, you got to store them, you got to make them. Instead, if we can mix it all for you, that's good for you. So we got to that stage, which then led to a whole diverse range of foods, not just your traditional homemade foods. You suddenly saw popcorns, you saw chips, which you never could actually dream of making at home. Suddenly you saw that these products were available, which then too went to your ready to eat or ready to cook kind of foods. So you already see that India has come a very long way, and people don't realize that. People still think that we are cooking at home, but we all only want somebody else to cook at home, not us. We always say, no, we should maintain tradition, we should maintain culture. And then you ask the question, are you willing to cook at home? He or she says, no, not me, but all others should. And they should keep, it's like telling Brazil that they should keep all the rainforests while we all will keep destroying because we want rains, so they should keep the rainforest. That's not fair. So if no one's willing to cook, then you have no right to ask somebody else to cook, right? So what I'm saying is, this trend has happened all over the world. And the only thing is, in terms of the size, the speed and the shape of what the final product is, the West has moved a long way. China is moving that way, and I don't see India escaping that trend. There is absolutely no way. The only question is how fast and how soon will that happen. So there is no way of going back. I just wanted to ask any one of you, would you spend the same time in the kitchen as your mother did? That includes the boys. Would you, anyone who says that they would like to spend the same time in the kitchen as their mother? Anyone? Nobody. So, where do you go from there? You got to eat. So, you can't buy in the restaurants. What do? This is exactly the driver which will push products onto the retail shelf from packaged foods. And this is something that you need to understand as food scientists. Now, it's a very quick look at the global processed food industry. These numbers don't mean that much only because the nature of the processed food industry is very different across countries. So you have a West or Japan which is very advanced in terms of the products. So you find, as I told you, finished products. Can you imagine making a pizza at home today? You don't. Very soon you will stop eating pizzas in the restaurants because they will be very, very expensive. You will go and pick up a frozen pizza and a chilled pizza like everybody else in the world. And this is the kind of stuff that's going to happen all around. And if you see countries here, what is striking is not just the size, but it's really the percentage growth rates. Where the growth rates are currently is there and there. But if you look at the FDI that's going into the food industry, that's enormous. That's more than 20-25% growth rate today. So what we're saying is that percentage that you're seeing 10 to 15% is very likely to be much, much more in India in the coming years. Which really means who is going to feed those industries with food scientists? That is the key question, and that's where I've come to you to say that you're all very lucky to be born at this time in India, where India will certainly require food scientists. But being a food scientist, I told you, is not just about titrations and alkali versus acid, etc. No, it's a lot more, we said, right? It's about understanding food. It's understanding consumers. It's understanding emotions, cultures, traditions, and everything. So in order to be a food scientist, you will have to be a multidisciplinary person. You will have to open out to everything. On one hand, you're a consumer, and on the other hand, you're a food scientist. And that's a very difficult balance. The question that you asked is processed food safe? And you're asking that question as a consumer. And as a food scientist, you need to ask the question, how do I make processed food safe? That should be your question. So that is a very difficult question to answer, but that should be your question. How do I understand food? What are the things I can do in order to make it safe, cheap, nutritious, convenient, and available at all times? Now, those are the challenges that you need to face. And you need to understand that it's a lot more than what you simply read in books, because once you get into the food industry, that's what they will expect you to know. So you need to be opening out your minds to everything else around. So when you go to the food shop next time, don't just pick up and walk away. Read the ingredients. Why is it that this one contains wheat and why is this one contains sugar? Is sugar good for me? Why is it that there is no sugar alternative available here? What are those alternatives? How do I go about it? So these are the questions you need to ask from now onwards whenever you look at food, and not just whether it's safe, whether it's tasty. Of course, those are the consumer questions. You need to then ask the food scientist questions. What are the opportunities in the agri-food industry? What I've done is here, if you start with a form and this is your food, there is a very long line. In fact, this can be split into another 20, 30, 40 sections, subsections. But grosso modo, you have this line. You can play a huge role here. Today, the agricultural world and the chemical-based raw materials for food are seeking people to help them to understand food, because they are a very long way away from food. That is their problem. So they don't understand. So typically a Syngenta, which I believe has been bought over today by a Chinese company, is asking the question, why is it that the consumer is not understanding genetically modified products? They are so good. I can offer it at such a low cost. They're very safe. Look at the Americans. They've been eating it for 3 generations, and the only change is they become probably more obese. But nothing much has changed in them. So why is it that consumer is against it? That's because they are very far away and they need all the help from people such as yourselves to understand the product. And when you work with them, you need to know right across the chain. It's not good enough to say, I know a lot about maize, so I will work for Cargill. No good. Because you must be able to understand why that maize has to be in a certain manner. Why you can do some hybrids and you can't do some hybrids. All those questions will come up, so you need that interdiscipline. And to give you a feel, these, what we call as bulk ingredients, you have a variety of products, hundreds and hundreds of products going into the food industry. So you certainly have a mega role to play right here at this stage. The next one is what we call as the transformation, because when you pluck a fruit from the plant, you can't just go and put it into a yogurt. Simple, right? It'll just sink. So when somebody eats a yogurt, they can keep eating a yogurt, there's no fruit, and finally they get a big huge lump of fruit with the nut in it, and it's not the experience they want. So you need to transform that fruit into a puree, or into a pulp, into some dices, whole range of things. And it's not good enough, because that little dice has to be evenly distributed in the fruit. Because every spoon I take, that fruit should be there. Otherwise, in one spoon I get a lot of fruit, another spoon I get only a yogurt. That's no good. Plus, that fruit should taste fresh. So I may have to add something to make that fruit taste better. Because as you know, when you pluck a fruit from a tree, it starts dying. So the second you pluck an apple from a tree, it starts to die. And over a period of time, it loses the flavor, as you know very well, and the taste and everything else. So in order to compensate for that, you may have to add something. Again, you want the fruit to float in some instances, in which case you may think of other things, a hydrocolloid. So it's a big process to take that fruit into the yogurt for the consumer. Whereas at home, he or she will just chop some fruit, put it in the yogurt, mix it, eat it, happy. But as a food scientist, you will have to think of a huge number of things just getting that fruit into the yogurt. You understand what I'm saying? So, Those are all the primary transformation of ingredients where you can play an enormous role, and India is growing significantly in that area, and they are looking for very competent food scientists right now. As you know, in India, food which is processed is right now most of the formulae come from outside, so they really don't develop products as many as we want internally. But whether the Prime Minister says or not, you have to make food in India once the volume reaches a particular level. You cannot import. And at that time, the requirement for food scientists such as you will be enormous. Just go back about 20 years ago when the computer software industry started. People studied software, but they couldn't get good jobs. There were few centers of excellence, and there was a problem because the supply of software scientists and the demand for software scientists could not be matched properly, and a lot of people were frustrated. But that was for a few years. And today, you can see how that is transformed completely, and then the software industry knows exactly what kind of people they want, and they are training people to become the world's best software scientists. So, the food industry, I'm certain, will become like that in the near future. The basic areas, food processing, that's where you find the three areas of ingredients, the process itself or the machinery, and the packaging. These three play a role in a factory, and you can play a role too within that factory or at the suppliers of each of those, that is a processing equipment or an ingredient supplier or a packaging manufacturer. I'm making it sound very simple. It's a very complex chain, but you can play a major role in any of those areas or even upstream or downstream of those. Finally, the food service and retail, they are going to be the largest probably in the world next to China or even bigger than China. They will need a lot of people. It's not just about quality control. Food services outside are divided into two parts actually. It's coming into India now. One is called contract catering, which is basically catering to schools, canteens, in offices, prisons, airplanes, those kinds of food. The other one is commercial catering, which is into restaurants all over the world. Now, for each one of them, the requirements are completely different, and they need food scientists to design and develop food. Food is not only nutrition, fuel, etc. We said that, it's also fashion. So when you actually design food for an airline, one of the main things is the visual appeal, the ease of eating, the fact that it should not smell, for example. If you go to supermarkets around the world, the fruit and the vegetables, they will not smell because they've been played around with, whatever you call it as, in order that you can walk around the store without having pungent smells. Now, these are all food science based. You can look at it either way, but those trends are there to stay. And once again, my request is, when you look at food science, do keep the consumer part at the back of your mind, but don't mix the two. Because once you mix the two, you're neither a food scientist nor a consumer. And that is the big danger that many food scientists today do. You can't be both at the same time. You'll have to be impassionate when you are looking at food science, but always keep the consumer in mind. It's not you, it's somebody else. And that's the way I look at food science all the time. So you have here a whole range of technologies. These are just examples, but there are many, many modern technologies. For example, if you just take encapsulation today, the length and breadth of encapsulation technologies is stupendous. Today you do it with yeast and every other thing that you can find, and all it has become, the cost has become very low. So today one talks about putting encapsulated flavors and even chewing gums, very low cost chewing gums. You can do a lot with these technologies where your role is enormously important, and in fact without people such as yourselves, those just don't work. So they need very, very good food scientists. And all these, as you know very well, the base, which is the quality control, the new product development, the R&D, these are the departments, but they manifest themselves across all these and more. So your opportunities, once again, are almost limitless from the point of view. Just to give you one example, just to give you one small example, if you take just soy, and you see how many things one can do and one does today, and where you can play a role. You can do nutraceutical fractions. They are very well known right now. You can take proteins, many types of proteins, and play around with them. These are emulsifiers, antioxidants, those kinds of ingredients you can take out. And also, you must have heard of soy milk, soy oil, all kinds of consumer products. And each one of them requires food science. And you see here, how many processes you can go through and how many parts of soy you can actually take products out of. And each one requires food science. Just to give you a tiny example of soy. And now when you multiply this across the spectrum of food, again the challenges are immense, and I would say the opportunities are immense. This is being done now in India. Many of these are being done in India. Not all. Why? Because on one hand the knowledge is limited, and on the other hand the demand is not there yet. But when that demand comes in, it has to be produced in India, as I keep saying, once the volumes go beyond a particular level. And you people, once again, can play a very, very strong role. When you take an ingredient in a product, roughly we say it's about 1/10 the value of the total product. Why? Because there are other elements to a product. Once you make a product, you have other costs, processing costs, packaging costs, distribution costs, the margins, etc. And finally the consumer gets it. So the ingredients, they do play a role to the extent of around 10%. But this is a very rough number. But that ingredient choice happens interactively with all the other departments of the company. And that's where you as food scientists will play a very strong role. So today, the R&D department will have to work iteratively with the costing department, with the marketing department, with all the other, the purchase department. So you really work with all the others before you come to a final product. And this is something that you ought to be aware of, that as a food scientist, you will not just be sitting in a little lab throughout your life, just mixing something and then delivering it. No, you're making food, and as we said, food is a very complex product with lots of emotions, traditions, culture apart from the science. So you need to interact with all these people to put that food together. And that's what you see here. All these various aspects come in, the consumer trust, the clean label, and many, many other issues, which will all come back to you. And they will say that you need to make a product. What is a clean label? And you as a food scientist, you may not agree with it, but if the marketing person says the clean label is the only thing we want, you need to find a way for it, or you need to find another company to work for. So it's going to be a huge challenge for you to interact with other departments in a company and then come to a holistic food which the consumer wants. You might have heard of some of these companies, but how many of you have heard of many of these which are very, very large ingredient suppliers in the world? And you will all be interacting with many of them, if not working with many of them. They're all very keen to set up shop in India, to be in India as India grows in the food industry. We are very aware because we are at the front end with all these people. They will all be here, and they're already here, and probably I will see many of you working for many of these companies in the future. just examples, you can see some of the challenges that you're also likely to face. We've been thrown these challenges. One of the mega-sized companies in the world asked us, hey, how do we develop processed flavors? You know processed flavors, I hope. It's the Maillard reaction flavors. How do we develop them as natural molecules through to the year 2020? How do we do that? So these are challenges which are almost fundamental in the food industry today. And you may all be part of it. I'm not saying that tomorrow they're going to ask you this question. If you do find the answer, probably one of you will get a Nobel Prize. It's very tough, but you may all be part of that kind of an adventure. Again, somebody may come to you as the R&D or the food scientist and say, look, we would like to buy this company with some kind of sweetener. Can you make similar sweeteners? Can we make that at the commercial level? Do we have such a technology? Do we understand that technology? Does it work for us? For example, fermentation. I always call fermentation half science because nobody really understands why that particular bug likes that particular protein and works in that particular substrate. It's very difficult. Even large fermenters have been to, including those in Japan, Korea and Europe and in the US, they never touch any of those elements because they're very worried that once at a commercial level it starts to work, it may not work properly. So you will be faced with those challenges and you need to be prepared for those. Again, about customers, about consumers, low salt, low sugar, you may have to work on them. Why? Because consumers are demanding for them. So the same ingredient, can I work on a low salt version? So it's all again consumer related. Brings me to the end to say that first of all, I wish you all the very best. I'm sure, I'm certain that all of you are much brighter than I am and you will all do very well in your lives. It's just that it requires, we said, a multidisciplinary approach to prepare yourself. Do not put your head down into the beaker and keep looking at the titration value. It's a lot more out there. You'll have to look at food as this complex thing which is really bundled up with emotions and passions and everything else, and understand that at any point in time it's culture based. Food can be very different in different parts of the world, so you need to be flexible in your approach. Wear your cap as a food scientist, but also remember to take it off sometime and wear your consumer cap, or at least find out as to what the consumer wants and do work with everybody in the company to create great processed foods for India. Thank you very much. Thanks a lot. If you have any questions at all, I'll be very happy to at least attempt to answer. How do you measure consumer acceptability? I think it's very, very important. It's very tough. It's very tough. Why? Because, as I said earlier, what consumer are you talking about? Like in a country like India, you want to launch a product and you want to find consumer acceptability. Well, before that, you've got to decide which consumer are you talking about. So, is it going to be only in the west of India? Is it going to be only in Tamil Nadu? Is it going to be national? So, that's the first question. I work for a company which used to produce and market national brands. And I was the product manager for a brand called Boost. Maybe you all know. It's a milk additive called Boost. And it's a national brand. And it goes to all parts of India. So exactly the same question we used to ask almost every day. What does this consumer want? And in addition, we also had a lot of constraints inside the company. We are also marketing another product called Horlicks. So we wanted to ensure that Horlicks and Boost don't compete with each other, with the same consumer. So first of all, we have to design and define amongst ourselves, what does this product give to the consumer? For example, if you take Horlicks and Boost, we define that Horlicks, the key word is health, and Boost, the key word is energy. Then the next step was to define the consumer. So based on that, you start to define the consumer. Why would somebody want to buy Boost, and where do they buy Boost? So you need to do all those iteratively. And once you are clear about what kind of consumer you want, you start to test the product. You start to first test it internally, and then you start to go out and test. There are very good models available these days which predict reasonably well the acceptability of a consumer. But the only problem is, it all changes. The consumer is the most untrustworthy person. Never sticks to one thing, changes totally illogical, changes his or her mind like that just because the neighbor said something is wrong. So what you really do is you present the various options and test out the acceptability. Now, in terms of the taste, there are standard, well approved taste panels, etc., which you've heard of, which lots of companies do. Particularly what I call as the flavor houses. They are now experts in testing those. But once again, lots of things have changed on those. Today, the social media has changed that completely. So consumer acceptability of, for example, textile. Today, more and more large textile houses, they don't go through standard consumer studies. What they do is, if it's a spring collection for next spring, they put it out 6 months ago on the Facebook of all their consumers and say, okay, here are these 5 models, which one would you use or which one would you prefer? And they take that feedback and start to work on it. And nowadays they even go one step further. They give you pieces of the dress and they say, you design it the way you want to and show me the way you like and in what color you want. So there is a lot more interaction that's possible today. Unfortunately, in food, you are not in a position to do that yet, but it's happening. In the US, there are these companies which are interacting directly with consumers rather than going through panels, etc., to test out whether they're acceptable. But that will not take away the basic tests, etc., that you need to do, which will always be there. But in all this comes cost. Because I still remember in my company when I launched a product, I don't want to say which product, but it just didn't work out, basically because by the time the finance department approved the product, there was nothing much left in the product because we had to take out everything because it was too expensive. So you have to also play the cost into all this while you test the product. But there are very, very efficient methods available in the marketplace. Very important question. Very important. Absolutely, absolutely, absolutely. You're very right. This actually, the basic argument is you waste more food at home. First of all, in the sense, why? Because of shelf life reasons. You cannot preserve food at home, so you invariably waste food. Whereas, in theory, most of the processed food, you can keep it that much longer. So, an equivalent product, you must be able to consume the processed food for a slightly longer time as compared to the same quantity produced at home. And as you know, you have to produce a minimum quantity at home. You can't just make 3 spoons of something. There is a minimum quantity, and you almost never get to eat everything because of children and other reasons, and you can't keep it. Whereas processed food keeps long. But then the challenge comes in terms of the packaging, the quality of the packaging, and particularly the size of packaging. Because as a manufacturer, I would like to sell large packs. That's where I make money. So I'd like to sell 2 kg packs of bhujia or whatever. Whereas for the consumer, it may be more ideal to buy a small pack of 200 grams, 300 grams, which you can consume and not waste. But that becomes very expensive. The smaller the pack, the unit cost becomes high for me as a producer and for you as a consumer. So what they are doing right now in terms of effort, all the companies are aware, the international companies are very aware. The waste can happen from the product itself. The waste can happen from the processing in terms of the energy they use, and the waste can happen at the packaging level. So they're trying to attack all three levels. For example, the waste that you talked about, one example I can give you, a concrete example, PepsiCo is working on an idea where it will have a potato chips factory where they won't get a drop of water from outside. They will cut the potatoes, take the water from the potatoes as they dry them, and circulate that water inside the plant to heat the plant. So they are planning such environmentally friendly operations, which you cannot do at home because you have a lot of constraints which only the industry can do. Similarly, in terms of packaging, in the West, if you come, that has been refined to a large extent. We used to have 5-6 packs for the same product. That's going down enormously. As you know, supermarkets today, they do not want to give you bags. At least in the West, they refuse to give you plastic bags, etc. So there is a lot being done to reduce the costs and wastage of packaging, and above all, the amount of food that you waste. And as I said, that is an individual's responsibility as much as the packaged food producer's responsibility. That company should try and sell packs which are in reasonable size, whereas the consumer should also pay a little bit more to buy packs which are small. In fact, the last one is in the food service wastage too. There's huge amount of wastage that's in the food service. You know the doggy bag concept in the US. You go to a restaurant, you eat only 70% because